And now in Auckland, she's the new head of the International Development for Plant and Food Research Group of the Bioeconomy Science Institute of New Zealand. So, and she's going to give us a Pacific perspective on food security. So please, Seeseei, welcome to the stage.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Ian, and thanks for not mentioning the rugby over the weekend. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Kia ora koutou, tēnā koutou, te alofa lava, and warm Pacific greetings. It is my pleasure and privilege indeed to be here today to share with you my perspectives on food security in the Pacific, although I have to admit that I was voluntold to come up here and speak on this topic. As Ian has mentioned, I spent 16 years working in the Pacific, and I've only been at my current role in New Zealand as the head of International Development for Plant and Food Research for 4 months. So the tone and some of the messages that I'll be sharing today will be of that duality. For my chat, I'll be presenting to you what traditional Pacific food systems look like, the threats that we're experiencing in that space and how they impact food security. And then I'll speak a little bit about a program that we have at Plants and Food Research, which is on climate smart Pacific food systems. And then I'll share a little bit about some of the transformations that I'd like to see or I'd like to advocate for in the coming years, and leave you all with a few challenges. Now, the Pacific and food. Food and the Pacific. When we talk about food in the Pacific, it's intimately intertwined with our culture, with our community, and with our environment. It's not just about calories, it's not just about sustenance, but it's about ceremony, it's about our identity and our connection, not only to our ancestors, but to our land and to our sea. Now, traditionally, food production in the Pacific involves sustainable mechanisms such as agroforestry, coastal fishing, communal food production, and sharing food, and seasonal planting calendars. What you will see is that we harvest or catch the food from our land, from the forests, from the rivers, and from the ocean, and they make it straight into our households, onto the plate. Very direct chain. And although there will be nuanced differences between Pacific Island countries and territories, between Polynesian groups, Melanesian groups, and Micronesian groups, we have commonality in our values when it comes to food, around reciprocity, around stewardship, and around sustainability. I'd now like to contextualize for you what Pacific food systems have traditionally looked like. On the screen here, you have a young agroforestry system in Samoa, where you will see trees grown together with food crops and some smattering of organic chicken there in the foreground. In that agroforestry, you have breadfruit trees mixed in there with cocoa, with coconuts, with bananas, with noni, and also trees that we use to build our huts. We have sustainable and subsistent coastal fishing. Traditionally, coastal fishing has been for livelihoods in terms of the foods that we eat, and also for cultural purposes. And I can remember a time in my childhood growing up in rural Samoan villages with my extended family, where my uncle would get his net and he'll go out and fish. And he'll fish just enough for our household dinner. Now, I do apologize if this gets a few people excited. This is what traditional food is for the Pacific, and particularly in this case for Samoa. And this is food that's been cooked on hot rocks in what we call laumu. It's about an hour to prepare and an hour to cook. And we see here, we have a selection of our carbs, which is our taro and our bananas. We have our protein source from our seafood and a little bit of greens. We've got taro leaves cooked in coconut cream, wrapped in breadfruit leaves. We're also blessed with a diversity of tropical fruit. On the screen, you see a colorful presentation of fruits that we have in the tropics, and this particular picture was taken in Western Highlands in Papua New Guinea. Over recent years, we've seen introductions into our food systems. So we've seen capsicums and spring onions, as pictured there, come into the Pacific to diversify our diets a little bit more. This picture was taken in Honiara markets in Guadalcanal from Solomon Islands. And an introduction of leafy vegetables and leafy greens. We see here leafy greens being sold at the Talamahu markets in Nuku'alofa in Tonga. So that's a representation, I think, of a fantastic food system, a colorful food system with some diversity. But the food system is under crisis because we are exposed to several threats. And in literature, you'll find these threats. First and foremost, we've got climate change. There's a sea level rise, there's saltwater intrusion, there's droughts, there's flooding, there's pests and diseases. We're often exposed on an annual basis to natural disasters. So we have annual cyclone seasons, and then interspersed in there are other natural disasters such as landslides, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. We also have to contend with socio and cultural priorities and migration issues. I'll speak more about seasonal labor schemes. I hope I don't get shot. And youth disengaging from agriculture. With urbanization, we're also seeing a shift in our diets in the Pacific, where we're moving towards a culture of convenience and where it's easier and cheaper for us to eat imported, ultra-processed foods. And then, of course, there's geopolitical influences wreaking havoc, can I say, on trade and influencing our food systems as well. So these are things that we see from published literature, but we also like to do a little bit of sense checking, really going into the communities and hearing from the people at the household level what challenges they're experiencing in the face of climate change that's hindering and proving challenging for them to grow their own food. And again, we hear the common topics of pests and diseases, saltwater intrusion, and challenges around water and irrigation. But we also started hearing things like the unpredictability of the seasons. Why is it wet when it's supposed to be the dry season? We're hearing issues around declining soil fertility, the need and the low access to seeds and planting material, and particularly the need to access climate tolerance, so heat tolerance, salt tolerance, vegetable planting material, and root crops as well. And again, we hear about the limited availability of labor. Allow me to contextualize further. We see here an image that was shared by SBC of a home garden of sweet potatoes and cassava that's been flooded. With climate change, we're seeing a shift in seasons, and we're seeing the wet season encroaching into the dry season. And that leads to a narrower window of when we can grow crops that we normally grow in the dry season. With climate change as well, we're getting wetter wet seasons when the rainfalls are heavier, and so there's more incidences and higher frequency of flooding. Natural disasters. In addition to annual tropical cyclone seasons, We've all seen the impact of the 2022 Honga Ha'apai volcanic eruption and the ensuing tsunami. That had a significant impact on agricultural production in Tonga that was valued at approximately $17 million. On the seasonal worker front, the recognised seasonal employer scheme, which New Zealand runs and has been running since 2007, and the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme that's been running since 2012 under various names. That's about 15, 18 years in place of seasonal workers migration. We see that there's varying contributions of these schemes to the population in the Pacific Islands. And although 5,000, 6,000, 12,000 may not seem like much in bigger populations, when we're talking about populations of 100,000, of 200,000, these numbers really do have significant effect. So from Samoa, you see that about 3% of our population leave the country annually for seasonal work. 3.8 in Vanuatu, 3.9 in Tuvalu, and a whopping 5% for Tonga. But there's no question about the value that seasonal workers and seasonal worker schemes bring to the Pacific. They contribute significantly to our GDP. In Samoa and in Tuvalu, remittances contribute to about 7% of the GDP. In Tonga, it's about 8.6%. And in Vanuatu and in Kiribati, it's about 10%. So these are significant contributions to the well-being of the Pacific from an economic perspective. But at what cost? We have reduced labor availability, particularly for commercial food production in Pacific Island countries and territories. And who are left behind? We have aged and the young left in the communities, now with the responsibility for food production. I'll pivot to talk about imports, food imports in this space. You'll see that from 1995, as represented on the graph, there's been an increasing trend of imported goods and consumable foods coming into the Pacific. At the top is total imports, net imports, and then imports by capita. Where are the imports coming from? We're seeing significant imports coming from Australia, from East and Southeast Asia, from New Zealand, from Europe, and from Northern America. What are the imports comprised? Initially, of healthy foods. Fresh fruits, such as the apples and the oranges that we can't grow in the Pacific. Fresh vegetables, seeds. But then over time, we see an increase in unhealthy foods being imported into the Pacific. Fatty meats, sweetened beverages, and savory and sweet snacks and meals and confectionaries. And I like to talk about post-harvest losses as a threat to food security. You see here on the graphs on the left, a declining trend of food production in the Pacific. On the top graph, it's starchy vegetables. And then on the bottom graph, it's fruits and non-starchy vegetables. In food systems where a downward trend in local food production is being observed, any level of food loss exacerbates the challenges in the food system, and it exacerbates food insecurity. I'd like to share some findings from an ASEA project that I had the privilege of being a part of, and this is the ASEA Pacific Food Loss Project. It was active in 4 Pacific Island countries in Fiji, Samoa, Solomon Islands, and Tonga. Supported by technical experts from the University of the Sunshine Coast, from Griffith University, and from Western Sydney University. In the Pacific, there's about an average of 5 to 10% of food loss, but we do see sporadic losses of up to 50%. 50%, which is half of what you've produced, and that's significant. The study also found that leafy vegetables, tomatoes, and papaya were the most vulnerable to these high losses. Illustrated here is what we mean when we talk about leafy greens. And you see that they're just looking very sad, very unappetizing at the market table. As part of that study, we unpacked the drivers and the reasons behind why we're seeing food loss in the Pacific. And first of that is around knowledge gaps. There were knowledge gaps existing in what optimal post-harvest handling looks like. There were knowledge gaps around market demands and meeting market demands, and lack of good agricultural practices. We also saw drivers involving infrastructure. So this is lack of cool chains and processing facilities, poor road access and transport mechanisms, as well as poorly designed markets. And we also see some challenges in the policy space, where although women comprised the majority of market vendors in the Pacific, they still faced greater infrastructural and systemic barriers. So you can thank me for a very depressing talk. So what do these threats mean for food security in the Pacific? And this is a very simplified diagram where we see the threats leading to reduced production of local foods. There's less availability of local foods at the markets, which means farmers have less income. When there's less food available, the prices go up. And in some instances, you will see increased food loss because nobody's going to be buying the expensive produce. But we see that in this system, we are perpetuating a reliance on imported foods. So we see an increase in the importation of foods. We've seen the trend that this is leaning more and more towards unhealthy foods. And when the local food's more expensive and when you've got limited income now, of course you're going to go and buy the cheaper, ultra-processed food that's available at the shop. Increased consumption of ultra-processed foods has landed us in our current non-communicable disease crisis in the Pacific. I think it's safe to say that there is food insecurity that we're contending with. If that wasn't depressing enough, here are some more sobering numbers. 9 out of 10 of the world's most obese countries are Pacific Island countries and territories. 88% of Pacific people, particularly Pacific adults, are not consuming enough fruit or vegetables. And 75% of deaths in the Pacific, adult deaths, are due to non-communicable diseases. So what are we doing about it? Although I'd very much like to say that I'm solving all of these problems with the work that we're doing in the Pacific, I can't. So we can't stop tropical cyclones and volcanoes and tsunamis. But I would like to share with you the work that we're doing in New Zealand at Plants and Food Research, particularly our Climate Smart Pacific Food System program. Now, this program is funded by the New Zealand government through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and it's active in 5 countries. It's active in Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, and in Tonga. And I'd like to acknowledge the people that we are delivering this work with and alongside. For this program, we are adopting a participatory action research approach where we've got 3 component views on what we hope to achieve, looking at on-farm, off-farm, and stewardship of land, water, and waste. We work in the communities with our local partners to co-diagnose what the challenges are, to co-identify and co-design with them what practical, low-cost, and innovative interventions might be. We trial these with them on the farm and at the research organization fields. We learn from each other what's worked, what hasn't worked, what needs to pivot. And when things have worked well, in that local context, we scale. Through the program, we have a lens on JETSI, climate resilience, creating an enabling environment, particularly for our partners, connecting and communicating mechanisms, and really focusing on environmental care as well. We like to think that this is a two-pronged approach. The bottom-up component is where we're working with the communities. We are addressing climate-related challenges on the ground. We improve local production. We improve resilience. We improve people's livelihoods. And when we have that evidence, we then present it to the policymakers. The policymakers will look at influence in creating an enabling environment for local food production and really encouraging them to renegotiate some of the trade influence that's impacting negatively on our local food systems. So what transformations do we need to see? In a room full of experts and researchers, I'm not going to talk about all the science that needs to happen. You're all very well versed in that space. But I would like to talk about the transformation that we need to see in how we do this work in the Pacific. This is a highly contested geopolitical space at the moment. We have large players on the landscape, including development agencies, donors, private sectors, philanthropic organizations, researchers, and regional bodies, and all coming into the Pacific with good intentions. But duplications and overlaps do exist. We're tripping over each other at the airports, flying to and flying from the Pacific. We're tripping over each other in country, replicating assessments, creating parallel reporting, competing for the attention of our local partners. Local partners have to manage the calendars around our travel calendars and juggle our visits like they have revolving doors. We need radical coordination. We need shared pipelines, interoperable MIRL frameworks, non-competing MIRL frameworks, pooled logistics, and harmonized training curricula as a start. And I know I can't see very well into the audience, but I can see that there might be a few people rolling their eyes, thinking that this is probably another added bureaucracy to the mechanism, to the machinery. But I'd like to reframe it as respect. Respect for our work, respect for our efforts, respect for the impacts that we hope to have in the Pacific, but also respect for our partners and their time when they need to work with us. The second transformation that I'd like to encourage and advocate for, and I'm going to sound like a broken record here to those of you who know me, but it's advocacy for local leadership, co-design, and sustainability. When we talk about local leadership, it means genuinely engaging with the Pacific leaders, with our Pacific partners, from the start of the project or from the start of the program. Not when it's been commissioned, not when it's ready to implement, not when all the contracts have been signed, but when it was just an idea, a thought bubble. Bring us to the table so that we can flesh out these ideas together. And that is co-design. It's creating that design together, building on that idea together. Not develop the design fully written and then send it for feedback. And sustainability. This really speaks to building the capacity or developing the capacity of our local partners so that over time, our donors and our development partners can transition out. So really, what I'm asking for, and I hope it's not too much, is respect for our Pacific identified priorities and our Pacific leaders, respect for the local voices, for the Pacific voices, for our traditional and our Indigenous knowledge. To end, I leave you with these challenges. To the researchers in the room, I challenge you to engage and empower your local partners and leads and embed participatory approaches into your programs and projects. To our donors and our development partners, I challenge you to fund longer-term and phased programs. And I challenge you to allocate at least 30 to 50% of that pledged funding to our Pacific partners. To our policymakers, I challenge you to develop inclusive policies that support Jitsi and youth engagement in our local food production, and challenge the trade landscape against ultra-processed foods and support locally processed foods. Now, I've been talking about food security, and I want to ensure that you are food secure, and I'm standing between you and morning tea, so I'd like to finish there and thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks so much, Seeseei, and I'm glad at the end you gave us some pointers as to it's not all doom, that we can actually work together to actually make some solutions happen. Are there any questions from the audience?
Everyone's been sufficiently depressed.
Could I start with one? Sorry, you're stuck with this one. Okay, and there's one that's okay. So I wanted to. You talked about solutions in different places. I was getting a good sense of the post-harvest and trade and those types of solutions that you're talking about. Can you say a bit more about what you were proposing from an on-farm point of view?
Thanks, Ian. Some of the trials that we have ongoing now in the Pacific is around very what we would probably call simple interventions, and we really want interventions to be simple, low cost, and practical for the Pacific context. An example of this is looking at intercropping corn with leafy greens that tend to struggle under high temperatures, and so we've got trials at looking at intercropping corns and lettuces. So we see and we hear from the growers that lettuces tend to struggle a little bit during the dry season when it's extreme heat. And so some of those practical on-farm interventions are things that we're trialing with our communities.
Thank you very much for taking us back to your roots. And yes, that diet, would love to taste some of that good food. You spoke about the shortage of labor. I'm keen to understand, what type of labor are you looking for? What are you doing about it? And what are the young people in your countries doing? And is there any opportunity to get them back into not agriculture as farming, but into food systems? Thank you.
Thanks for that fantastic question. One of the partners that we work with on our Climate Smart Pacific Food Systems program is a commercial company. And when he talks about labor shortage, he talks about when there's no people there to work the land in the commercial farm context, and no people to work in the factories that they have for processing. We are currently exploring and thinking out an idea of enabling or strengthening and empowering the people who are left behind in terms of food production. And we recognize that these are aged people. We recognize that these are the young people. And we're figuring out a way to navigate what might be some of the agricultural practices that would support them. So not the labor-intensive approaches, but something that would be suitable for the aged and the young.
Seeseei, was struck by, that you mentioned that often the donors and partners have good intentions, and I'm sure that's right. But in the last few decades, I think there's been a move to intentions that are also aligned to national or geopolitical influences. So how at that higher level do we get that coordination that you're looking for in an era where we're having more and more fragmented interests at a higher level?
I don't necessarily have a magic answer just yet. I was at a roundtable a couple of weeks ago with SBC in the Pacific and with some of our major development partners in the room. And that was one of the key conversations that we had. It was around better collaboration and better coordination. Whether we see that coordinating happening from within the Pacific to our external development partners, that's something that's yet to be seen, or whether we see it as something that we need to do from this side before we go into the Pacific Island countries to provide the support that we're theoretically there for. Cool.
Right. Well, Seeseei has already mentioned the fact that we've got a bit of a problem now with our food and nutritional security. So it is morning tea.